For more than 3 decades, a soft-spoken man in a hand-knit cardigan sat down in front of camera, looked directly into the lens, and told an entire generation of children that they were special just the way they were. There are no explosions, no laugh tracks, no frantic editing. Just a trolley, a changing pair of shoes, a fish tank, and a neighborhood full of puppets who worried, celebrated, and grew alongside the audience watching from home. Fred Rogers built something that looked simple on the surface, but was, in almost every meaningful way, a quiet act of rebellion against everything children's television was supposed to be. Behind that calm exterior was a man making deliberate, sometimes daring choices. Choices that touched on segregation, war, grief, and identity, decades before issues-based programming was even a phrase anyone used. Today, we're counting down 15 facts about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood that reveal just how much was happening beneath that gentle surface. Some are heartwarming, some are strange. A few might genuinely surprise you. Let's start at the beginning, in the summer of 1969, with a small plastic pool and a decision that quietly defied the country it was broadcast into. In the summer of 1969, American television was still largely allergic to anything that touched on race relations directly. Most children's programs simply avoided the subject altogether, treating the civil rights struggles playing out in newspapers and on nightly newscasts as topics far too heavy for a preschool audience. Fred Rogers took a different approach, and he did it without a single word of explanation. He filled a small plastic wading pool with water, sat down, and invited Francois Clemens, who played the recurring role of Officer Clemens, to join him and cool his feet on a hot day. The two men sat together, talked quietly, and shared a towel afterward as if nothing about the moment required comment. To modern eyes, the scene might look almost quaint, but in 1969, publicly shared swimming pools were still flashpoints of racial tension across the United States. Just years earlier, footage of pool owners pouring chemicals into water because black swimmers had joined white swimmers had circulated nationally. Against that backdrop, two men, one black, one white, sharing the same small pool of water on public television was not an incidental image. It was a statement, delivered with total gentleness and zero fanfare. Rogers never turned to the camera to explain the symbolism. He didn't need to. The message was built into the ordinariness of the moment itself. Sharing space and comfort with one another was simply how neighbors behaved. What makes the moment even more remarkable is that Rogers revisited it decades later. In 1993, reenacting the same simple scene with Clemens long after the country had supposedly moved past the tensions of the late 1960s. That repetition wasn't nostalgia. It was a reminder that the lesson still mattered. In a show built almost entirely out of small, unhurried gestures, a plastic pool became one of the most quietly powerful images American television ever produced. Not because it shouted, but because it refused to. Long before Michael Keaton ever put on a cape and cowl, he was a young performer in Pittsburgh trying to find any foothold he could in local television production. In the mid-1970s, that foothold turned out to be Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where Keaton worked behind the scenes as part of the floor crew. His responsibilities were about as far from Hollywood glamour as it gets, moving props, helping set up scenes, and, in one of those details that feels almost too perfect, physically operating the neighborhood trolley that shuttled viewers between the real world and the neighborhood of make-believe. Keaton wasn't confined entirely to the shadows, either. He made at least one on-camera appearance, playing one of the Flying Zucchini Brothers during a circus-themed episode, a small but memorable dip into the show's playful, low-stakes absurdity. For a young actor still years away from national recognition, this was simply a job, steady work on a well-run local production, with none of the mythology that would later attach itself to it. What stayed with Keaton, by his own later accounts, wasn't the trolley or the props, but the man running the show. He would go on to describe Fred Rogers as one of the most consistently kind and grounded people he ever worked alongside, a notable observation from someone who spent the following decades working across the full spectrum of film and television personalities, from independent productions to major studio sets. There's a particular irony in knowing that the actor who would later embody one of pop culture's darkest, most brooding vigilantes spent his early professional life making sure a cheerful cardboard trolley hit its mark on cue. It's a reminder that even icons start out doing unglamorous, practical work, and that the people who make children's television run smoothly rarely get remembered for it. For more than 30 years, Fred Rogers maintained his body weight at almost exactly 143 pounds, and he did it with a level of consistency that friends and colleagues found almost startling. This wasn't about vanity, athletic performance, or any conventional health goal. For Rogers, the number itself carried meaning. He was known for pointing out half-seriously that I has one letter, love has four letters, and you has three letters, 1, 4, 3. To him, 143 became a kind of private shorthand for the exact message he spent his entire career trying to communicate to children, that they were loved. Turning a routine act, like stepping on a bathroom scale, into a quiet daily ritual of intention says a great deal about how Rogers approached even the smallest parts of his life. At a time when much of American culture was consumed by diet trends, body image anxieties, and the ever-shifting standards of physical appearance being sold through magazines and television, Rogers took something as mundane as a number and made it personal, even spiritual. It wasn't a performance for anyone else. Few people outside his close circle even knew about the connection until well after his career had made him a household name. The story didn't end with Rogers himself. Years after his passing, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania formally recognized May 23rd as 143 Day, a day dedicated to celebrating kindness and neighborliness in his honor. An entire state holiday built, quite literally, around a number Fred Rogers turned into a love letter to the children watching him. Few images are more associated with Mr. Rogers' neighborhood than the daily ritual of Fred Rogers walking through his door, hanging up his jacket, pulling on a cardigan, and swapping his dress shoes for a pair of soft canvas sneakers. Over the decades, that small sequence became something close to sacred, a signal to millions of children that it was time to slow down, settle in, and pay attention. But the sneakers didn't start out as a symbolic gesture at all. They started as a fix for a technical problem. Early on, the studio floor amplified the sound of Rogers' dress shoes far more than anyone wanted. Every step registered on the microphones, turning quiet, intimate conversations into a percussive soundtrack of clicks and echoes that clashed with the calm tone the show was trying to establish. The production solution was refreshingly simple. Switch to soft-soled sneakers that wouldn't make noise as Rogers moved around the set. It was a practical decision made to solve an audio headache, nothing more. But children don't experience television the way sound engineers do. What began as a fix for microphone feedback slowly transformed, in the eyes of the audience, into something much bigger. Watching Rogers change his shoes each episode became a dependable cue. The outside world's noise and rush were being left behind, replaced by unhurried presence and attention. What started purely as a production workaround became one of the most emotionally resonant rituals in the history of children's television. Proof that meaning doesn't always start out intentional. Sometimes it's built, episode by episode, entirely by the audience. Point 5. One voice behind an entire cast of puppets. The neighborhood of make-believe was populated by an enormous range of personalities. The imperious King Friday, 13, the anxious and gentle Daniel Striped Tiger, the unpredictable and mischievous lady Elaine Fairchild, and dozens of others who each felt distinct enough to be memorable. What many viewers never realized, especially as children, is that the overwhelming majority of those voices came from a single person, Fred Rogers himself. Rather than assembling a large voice cast for the puppet segments, the production leaned almost entirely on Rogers' own vocal range, using subtle shifts in pitch, cadence, and rhythm to distinguish one character from the next. It was, in practical terms, an efficient production choice, but also gave Rogers an unusually direct way to explore different emotional registers through characters that weren't explicitly him. Through Daniel Striped Tiger, he could voice fear and uncertainty in a way that might have felt too exposed coming directly from Fred Rogers, the host. Through King Friday, he could dramatize stubbornness, control, and eventually the willingness to change one's mind. Through Lady Elaine, he could explore rule-breaking and unpredictability. Children watching at home had no idea they were listening to one performer essentially running a small repertory company by himself. They simply experienced a neighborhood where a wide range of inner states, worry, bravado, curiosity, defiance, were each given their own voice and their own moment to be taken seriously. In hindsight, it's one of the more quietly impressive performing feats in television history, an entire emotional ecosystem built out of a single, endlessly flexible voice. Fred Rogers' cardigan sweaters were as recognizable as his voice, and for good reason. They weren't costume department creations at all. They were made, one by one, by his mother, Nancy Rogers. Season after season, viewers watched him put on garments that had been knitted by the same hands that had cared for him since childhood, a detail that gave an already warm image an even deeper layer of authenticity. Rogers spoke about this openly on the show itself, at times holding up a photograph of his mother and explaining, in his characteristically direct way, that these were the sweaters she made for him to wear during their television visits. When Nancy Rogers passed away in 1981, the production faced an unusual